Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also, interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. I want to give a quick shout out to all of you who are part of the RAINMAN'S Take community. Thank you very much. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so by hitting that button down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and go ahead and watch this video to the end. I know if you're new, you're really going to enjoy the content. By watching to the end, that also is going to help me with the YouTube algorithm, which will also allow me to get this out to more people so that we can continue the conversation. So with that being said, let's go ahead and kick this off, my take about what's going on in Israel right now. So, to start off, let me first say that the terrorism we've witnessed so far in Israel has been horrific, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. The gruesome targeting of innocent civilians is barbaric and has no place in the modern world. Unfortunately, that's what gets people's attention and pegs the emotional meter to 11, which is exactly what that attack did. Israel has every right to defend itself, and I'm afraid that that probably means the eventual and total destruction of modern Gaza. After all, from what I understand, there are miles and miles of tunnels used by Hamas terrorists to pre-position weapons used to carry out terrorist attacks, and those are built under probably hundreds of buildings in Gaza, including hospitals, schools, religious sites. It is truly insane what they've been doing over there. So that leads me to the reason why I wanted to give my take on the situation. And I know this is going to piss off a lot of people, but I have to get this off my chest. I wanted to wait a few weeks to kind of put my thoughts together just to make sure what I was thinking actually makes sense to me, and hopefully it does to you as well. The bottom line is this is as horrific an attack as 9/11 was to the U.S. 22 years ago. The death toll is about half of what 9/11 was, but the outcome, I fear, will be almost identical. It pains me to say this, but I think the Israelis knew about the attack and let it happen. It is insane for a citizen of Israel to contemplate that concept, however, but I believe that that's actually what happened with 9/11 here as well. Our government knew about it and allowed it to happen. So, give me a chance to explain my position here. In the 22 years since 9/11, there have been many books and reports written to provide evidence to my claim. Of those, the one that's had the most impact on my thinking was the book Crossing the Rubicon by Michael Ruppert, written in 2004. This is the first book I read after I got back home from my second combat deployment in Iraq. I've mentioned this several times in the past. When I got back, my whole worldview changed, and I no longer believed the things I did before I left for Iraq. This is just one of the many things I found that didn't add up over there, and that was Halliburton's involvement. Now, Halliburton, through its construction subsidiary, Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR as people know it, received no bid contracts to build out all the new U.S. bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that contract was worth billions of dollars. So let me just give you a quick quote here from, I got this from the Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica's website, and this describes Halliburton for you if you don't already know this. So Dick Cheney, who was the vice president of the United States at the time of 9/11, this is what the Encyclopedia Britannica says about Halliburton and Dick Cheney. Cheney left Halliburton in 2000 to join the George W. Bush presidential campaign, and he later served as vice president in the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009. During Bush's first term, U.S.-led forces embarked on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Halliburton, principally through its KBR subsidiary, received bigger U.S. government reconstruction contracts than any other company for work in the two countries. Many of those contracts were awarded without competitive bidding. Critics Critics charged favoritism at the time, and KBR was later accused of mismanagement. In 2006, Halliburton spun off KBR into a separate corporation. So I'm not going to rehash that situation, but I will only say this. At the very least, on the face of it, that would have been a massive conflict of interest for the vice president at the time. And there's no way you can convince me that Cheney wasn't benefiting in some way from the company that he once ran. So the wars in Iran, I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq would have never happened if not for the horrors of 9/11. That galvanized the U.S. behind the concept of retribution for the terrorists responsible. Does that sound familiar? Think of what's going on right now. So back to the book, Crossing the Rubicon. So Michael Ruppert was, among other things, a former Los Angeles police detective. He died in 2014. He wrote the book like a police detective investigating a crime scene, which basically downtown Manhattan was. Just follow the evidence and see where it takes you. So over the years, that book has been pilloried as conspiracy theory. And I completely disagree with that, but that is a tactic used to downplay any research or facts that go against the prevailing narrative. Almost immediately, anyone who gets that label is considered a nut job, and their research and investigations are rabbit holed and downplayed to the point where the general public doesn't take the research seriously, and it is easily brushed aside. Now, I think this is a shame because over the years, multiple conspiracy theories have actually been proven to be fact. Most of the time, it is well after the fact and the events that took place, and the general population has lost interest because inevitably the 24-hour news cycle has their attention somewhere else. As a result, nobody seems to want to find the truth, or at least an accurate description of what really happened, except for those with an open enough mind to explore several layers below the narrative that they've been fed. Now, if you have any questions about what happened on 9/11/2001, which now feels like ancient history, I highly recommend you read that book. For me, it was the red pill that started it all. Like I said before, I believe the war in Iraq would never have happened. Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11 except for being a cheerleader for the perpetrators. And as we all know now, he didn't have weapons of mass destruction either. Yet almost immediately after 9/11, the war hawks were all screaming to invade Iraq. Many of George W.'s cabinet members were holdovers from his father's administration. Now, the first Bush was the commander-in-chief for the first Gulf War in the early 90s, and it was well known most in the national security apparatus and the military wanted to go after Saddam in Iraq back then, but did not. So there was a serious feeling of the job not being completed. Now, if you're old enough to remember, we, the U.S. citizens, were so emotionally charged with revenge that any connection of terrorism to anything was immediately fair game for destruction without any question or debate. And that's exactly what the powers that be did, culminating in the infamous Colin Powell speech at the UN charging Iraq with having WMDs. Anyone who voiced the opinion that Iraq should not be the target were labeled as cowards and traitors and were completely dismissed. Now, can you see where I'm going with this? This seems to be happening right now with the events in Israel as well. Rumors and disinformation and outright lies flew. Again, does this sound familiar to what's happening in Israel? If you're paying attention, it should. Now, I'll just give you just a few examples of the similarities I see that has led me to feel the way I do. Again, let me just say, I agree that Israel has the right to defend itself and to seek punishment for those responsible to ensure that something like this can never happen again. What I'm concerned about right now is what happens after that. What are the powers that be pushing for that otherwise might be unrealistic or impossible to achieve in a world before the recent Hamas terrorist attacks? This is what I'm seeing right now with the similarities between our 9/11 and the recent Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel. First, hardliners in power are trying to coalesce their power. Now, in the U.S., that was George W. Bush was seen as weak initially after his election, and he was surrounded by hardliners from his father's era. In Israel, Netanyahu's core conservative government is in disarray over the the past few years, and they're trying to gain power or stay in power. Second is serious unfinished business. For the U.S., ever since the first Gulf War, the U.S. has wanted to get rid of Saddam, and some would say access the oil fields in Iraq. In Israel, they've always wanted to gut Gaza so it couldn't be a safe haven and staging area for terrorist attacks. They've said that they cannot have a nuclear Iran and have threatened in the past to destroy that capability. And then number three, an empire who's trying to maintain its power. In the U.S., in the late 90s, the fear was peak oil, and Iraq had oil. Continue the empire by increasing our energy and power. In Israel, they've always identified Hamas and Hezbollah, both proxies for Iran, as existential threats to Israel. But up until now, the idea of a regional war with Iran was not very popular among the general citizenry. However, I think the most striking and scary similarity, in my view, is these are false flag events meant to coalesce public and private support behind going after those three objectives. So it's my contention the U.S. and Israeli governments had knowledge of and allowed these horrific events to happen. Now, if you think this is insane, you're probably unfamiliar with the concept of a false flag incident. It's an event that allows the powers that be to enjoy almost unanimous support from the general population for a policy that otherwise would not be popular, and to blame a perceived enemy so as to set the stage for policies and actions to be put in place with the support of an unquestioning population who is now completely emotional about the events and their response. How can our government do this? How can they let their own citizens be murdered? Well, unfortunately, it has happened before. A couple of examples. Pearl Harbor to get the United States into World War II. It's widely held that there was some intelligence and forewarning of that attack taking place. Also, at the time in the early 40s, the vast majority of Americans were isolationists and did not want to be involved in a war in Europe or in the Far East. And then the assassination of JFK, which installed a president who wanted to increase U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And then that was followed a couple years later by the Tonkin Gulf incident, which sealed the fate of the United States' involvement in escalation in Vietnam. Now, you could say the assassination wasn't a false flag necessarily, but it's widely considered to have been an inside job to replace the president with one who was very much in favor of military involvement in Vietnam. And that's exactly what happened. Now, those are just three examples from the last 100 years of false flag events. The actual acts of terror on 9/11 and Gaza had to be so horrific that they would force the citizens of each country to come together. This was accomplished through the emotionally horrifying acts committed. Now, the citizens are so incensed that all they want is revenge. Now the government steps in and says, this is what we're going to do and who we're going to go after. And if they can make that connection, then anything goes. Now, in the U.S. case, they said we're going after Iraq. The Israelis want to go after Iran and gut Gaza. As sad as I am that innocent civilians are again fodder for the larger strategic plan, I'm not going to fall for this again. After 9/11, I was ready to go to war, and I did. Like most of you, I'll never forget that day. And I was like everyone else. I didn't care what it would take. We needed to kill those responsible. In both these instances, psychopaths that perpetrated these crimes are just that, murderous animals, who in my view could not have done anything of this magnitude without serious assistance from major players. In my case, I was so emotionally charged that I didn't need or want to hear anything other than what we were being told. I just wanted revenge after 9/11. Now, as you know, I joined the reserves right after 9/11, and in 2004 was in Iraq in a full-on war zone. My entire life changed after that experience. Now, I've witnessed firsthand what happens when a citizenry gives their government carte blanche after a horrifying event, and the results are inevitably war and destruction, consolidation of government powers, and loss of freedoms. I realized something was wrong while I was in Iraq and educated myself when I got home as to what it was that I was experiencing. If you're pissed off that I'm blaming my government for allowing 9/11 to happen, something that I think impacted every American, if not personally, then on a national level, I highly recommend you read the book Crossing the Rubicon by Michael Rupert. Now, be careful about reacting out of emotion. And I know that's hard to do, especially if you have been directly impacted by these events. But now is when we need cooler heads to prevail. Even though I think that is probably impossible at this point with what has been happening in Israel. When something like this happens, the government comes together to increase their power, and we must go along with it. Now just think, on October 26, 20 years ago, the U.S. unanimously passed the Patriot Act as a result of 9/11. Most people today would say that that was a huge mistake because of the freedoms that have been curtailed or completely done away with, all in the name of security and revenge. Now, if you are ready to really understand what our governments are capable of, again, please read Crossing the Rubicon. But be warned, you will be forever changed. Your view of our world will be altered forever. Now, there'll be some of you who go off on me for saying that, and that's okay. But I'm not going to fall for that again. Unfortunately, I feel like we're going to watch the current conflict escalate, completely incapable of making any kind of a difference, as the world again seems on the verge of making the same mistakes we did after 9/11. So why am I saying this now? There was an article on October 8th, the day after the Hamas terrorist attack on Gaza, that was questioning the official narrative that Mossad was caught completely by surprise by the attack. And there were also rumored reports of the IDF being told to stand down during the attack, and that Egypt actually had warned of an impending attack. Now, who knows if those are accurate or not, but what is interesting and very telling to me is you don't hear much about that right now. Everything, counter narratives are gone. We started labeling anybody who doesn't agree with that anti-Semites. So you can see the narrative starting to be solidified. Now I'm going to read a little bit from another article that I found regarding this. And this is from Zero Hedge. And it was titled, Israelis Question the Catastrophic Intelligence Failure. And this was on Sunday, October 8th, the day after the terrorist attack. And the article reads, and I'll quote here, Israeli officials and media pundits now want answers. How could Israel's most celebrated and storied intelligence organization, Mossad, have missed it? How did the military not have any foreknowledge that this was coming? How did the Gaza jihadists overrun several IDF outposts so swiftly and easy? Some have gone so far as to speculate that the Netanyahu government may have had awareness that something was coming, but planned to exploit any assault as a justification to wipe out Gaza and to launch a major ground war against Hamas. As of Sunday, Prime Minister Netanyahu had officially declared war on Hamas. And this was also part of the article that was a screenshot of a Instagram or an X account from somebody that day. This was from a former IDF soldier, and it was on her X account right after the attack. So the ex-IDF soldier explains that the events took place today are impossible. She was a border observer with the highest tech available, and she quotes in her X posting, "If a bird came close to the walls, we knew it. Even a cockroach came to our fence border, we knew it. How did 400 Hamas pass through today?" So these are not only pundits but also veterans that were immediately questioning what they were being told as how this happened. And so we're seeing all over the Western world right now radical departures from existing failed policies. For example, French President Macron, almost immediately after these attacks, was taking a hard line, saying he's going to deport all Muslim extremists from France. In my view, too little, too late, because there are currently areas of Paris where you cannot even enter if you're not Muslim. And how many extremists are in those areas? Or in our case, a U.S. politician stating we should expel all Hamas supporters. Yet we have no idea how many are here or who have come across our border. And as of right now, we think I've had at least 275 individuals on the terror watch list have been caught coming across our wide open southern border. How many more have come across? I mean, every picture that I've seen recently of quote unquote asylum seekers waiting to come across are young men of military age, seemingly with no families. We have no idea who is coming to our country right now. The West has let their guard down, and that's going to be to our detriment, I feel, unfortunately. So one more thing about that Zero Hedge article I just mentioned. Crossing the Rubicon is basically 675 pages of damning evidence about U.S. intelligence failures, quote unquote failures, to stop 9/11 from happening. So where do I see this going? And I said this almost immediately. We're about to see the Middle East and probably the world explode into conflict. Iran is in the crosshairs and has always been the main objective, as is clearing out, or read, destroying Gaza of Hamas terrorists. Lindsey Graham is now calling for the U.S. to bomb Iran. However, thankfully, there are cooler heads trying to defuse the situation. Unfortunately, I don't have any confidence that that's going to work, but we'll see. And I'm going to bring up another article here that kind of pertains to what Lindsey Graham had said and what some of those cooler heads have said. And this one, I'm going to read most of the article because I found it very important, and I really think it's important that everybody knows this. It's titled, Rand Paul Urges U.S. to Stay Hands-Off Gaza Attack. And this was from Wednesday, October 11th, so just a few days after the attack. It was authored by Steve Watson via Summit News. And I'm quoting the article here. Senator Rand Paul offered a voice of reason Monday, cautioning that the U.S. should see where the facts lie before rushing into any military response to the Hamas attack in Gaza. While other Republicans, including Lindsey Graham, urged that Iran's nuclear and energy facilities should be bombed, Paul noted that there has been a history of the U.S. using such events as pretext to start conflicts that were not ultimately in the best interest of the nation. This is Paul quoting here, let's let Israel do what they need to do, which is have a punishing response to the people in Gaza to say no more. We are not going to let this happen. He adds, I have nothing but sympathy for the Israeli people at this time. I think that the primary objective this time has to be to get the people that attacked them. They were in Gaza. The senator continued, before we think about spreading this to the rest of the world, maybe we have to think about what is going on the ground there. I do think there is an immediate reaction sometimes to get everybody. Let's get everybody who is responsible. Without question, Iran had their hands in this. But if you remember after 9/11, there are people who wanted to attack Iraq. They said Iraq did 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Let's see where the facts lie and let's investigate this, Paul urged. He continued, everybody has an anger. I have an anger. I have no sympathy for those thugs pulling men, women, and children, shooting people point blank. Nobody should have sympathy for them. I think that they use sympathy for their cause by doing such horrendous and outlandish things. But at the same time, people say, we need to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. We're going to bomb them. You've got to realize that there have been assassinations of nuclear scientists in Iran over the last 6 to 8 years. Every time we assassinate one of them, our enrichment goes higher. We've had maximum pressure of sanctions, and the enrichment goes higher. So he's trying. Unfortunately, I think Rand Paul's statements are falling on deaf ears, and people are probably going to follow what Lindsey Graham is saying, which unfortunately is, I think that's going to get us into a lot more problems. And then one more article pertaining to that I read, and this came from October 23rd, and it's basically just a transcript of an interview that Tucker Carlson did with retired Colonel Douglas McGregor, talking about potential nuclear event coming from these from the situation in Israel and beyond. And in the interview, Carlson starts off by highlighting Lindsey Graham, who, and Carlson's quoting Graham here now, if Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, launches a massive attack on Israel, I consider that a threat to the state of Israel, existential in nature. I will introduce a resolution in the United States Senate to allow military action by the United States in conjunction with Israel to knock Iran out of the oil business. And again, like I said, I wish people would think about what Rand Paul is saying, but unfortunately, I think the way things are going right now, what Lindsey Graham is saying, which I think is completely scary, is going to carry the day. So my main reason for RAINMAN'S take has always been to try and tell people to be very skeptical of those in power and their narratives, and not trust the news. As they say, the casualty of war is always the truth. And competing narratives are in full display right now in Israel. Just take the bombing of the hospital in Gaza just a few days ago. The emotionally charged will blame each other. irrational will question. And thankfully, at least for now, it seems like cooler heads have prevailed as they're trying to figure out what actually happened with that hospital bombing. Now, again, I refuse to be fooled again. Be very careful of people trying to manipulate our emotions to promote an agenda. We've seen this in the past. I know that's a very hard thing to do, and I must admit I reacted emotionally when I heard news coming out of Gaza during the attack. And I realized it's probably impossible for those who are directly affected by the terror attacks to not react emotionally. But we must fight that impulse because really tragic consequences are the result, like the passing of the Patriot Act or the war in Iraq in the U.S.'s case. To paraphrase the famous saying, all in the name of security did we give up our personal freedoms. When you give up freedoms, all in the name of increasing security, you inevitably lose both. That's what the Patriot Act did. The result of the attacks is a call for destroying Gaza and attacking Iran. And this is coming from both the U.S. and Israel, as just stated there with Lindsey Graham's comments. Very similar to the call to take out Iraq after 9/11, even though they had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks. The difference being, however, is that at the time, Iraq was a pariah with very few allies. Iran is allied with both Russia and China. And I hate to think about what might happen if Iran is attacked. And I'll go ahead and read from another article here that kind of talks about what potentially could happen as the dominoes begin to fall in that region. And this is from the website thecradle.co, and it's titled "Iran Saudi Leaders Discuss Israeli War Crimes in Palestine." And this was from October 12th, and the subtitle was "The War Between Gaza and Israel has seemingly put an end to the prospect of normalization deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel." And I'll quote the article here from the website. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have held their first ever telephone conversation late on October 11th to discuss the need to end war crimes against Palestine. According to Mohammed Jamshidi, political advisor to the Iranian president, the Crown Prince warned that failing to recognize Palestinian rights would further inflame the situation, adding that cooperation between Riyadh and Tehran can contribute effectively and quickly to putting an end to the conflict inside Palestine. So you're now seeing even the Saudis are siding against the U.S. and Israel. They have supposedly been our friend in the region who have helped the U.S. become the dominant world power because of our reserve currency status. And this was due in large part to the petrodollar system put in place between our two countries, Saudi Arabia and the United States, in the early 70s. So you can see how this horrific terrorist event has the very real chance to explode into a regional or even a global conflict. And that should concern everybody. A Navy SEAL friend of mine had a geopolitical take on Iran. The West has wanted to take out Iran for decades after the Ayatollahs took over in the late 70s. Iran has been a thorn in the side of our Middle East policy with their direct and indirect support of most terrorist organizations that want to see the Christian West and Israel destroyed. Now, always remember, our entire Middle East policy is centered around oil. It always has been and always will be. Also, remember that Israel is the only democratic pro-Western country in that region. So the U.S. is riding a very fine line in this area, and any escalation has the potential to bring in Iranian allies, Russia and China. The grand chessboard is in play, as Zbigniew Brzezinski once called it. It's horrifying to think that governments will sacrifice their own people in order to win at this geopolitical game. But like his book said, this is about trying to salvage the U.S.'s geopolitical imperatives at a time when several other players want to be superpowers. Right now, we're witnessing the competition for world control in an emerging multipolar world. In the end, our country and Israel will potentially be drained of our blood and treasure again, as we've seen with our last 2 decades-long conflicts in the region. And always remember what resulted from 9/11, the invasion of Iraq and its oil fields, and we almost unanimously passed the Patriot Act, which has restricted our freedoms still to this day. So that's basically it for now. that's my take on what's going on over there and where this potentially could go. And quite frankly, I'm worried, and I'm not optimistic about the outcome, but who knows? We'll see. So that's it for now. I really appreciate you listening, and I'll finish like I always do, and that is if you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. This is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.